All right, so we're going to get started here. Welcome everyone to day 2 of the SBX Plenary. The title of this plenary is Innovation Fast Enough, Far Enough. So we have a great panel here today. We have Celeste Tell from Epicycled. We have Lucas Toffoli from RMI. We have Alan Prager from Building Ventures, and we have Steve Ruby from McKinstry. So one thing I'd like to start this panel out with is just to set the tone, since we are talking about innovation, we're talking about the future, we're talking about achieving these pretty ambitious decarbonization goals. So I just want to declare this panel a safe zone for the future and for deep innovation. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion and looking forward to input and questions from the audience. So first, I will provide some framing, and then the panelists will introduce themselves, and we will start digging into the issues of building decarbonization, scale, and pace. And so I should also just mention that the audience can pose questions. We'd like to have those questions go through the Q&A function of the conference platform, and we'll be monitoring those questions. So let's get started. So I am going to share my screen and just go over a few framing slides to kick off the conversation. So just 1 second here while I get that all set up. All right. And all right, I'm in slide mode. So I'm Poppy Storm. I'm the founder and director of innovation at 2050 Institute, and I work with states, utilities, cities, and other key actors to scale building decarbonization by 2030 and to create a zero emissions building sector by 2050. So one of the first things that we want to ask is that when we're thinking about the question of fast enough, far enough, we kind of have to consider the dimensions of that question. So what is the actual scale and pace required to meet 2050 goals? We often think about scale in an abstract sense. We need to scale. But what does that actually mean if we really have this endpoint of 2050? So in many parts of the country, states and local governments, they have economy-wide emissions limits and reduction goals, but many, like in Washington State, they don't have building sector targets. So they also don't have statutory commitments or effective metrics or any kind of transparent tracking. And that's for the building sector. A lot of those things do exist for other areas, but they don't exist for the building sector. So it is kind of hard to know and to rally a lot of key actors and all actors really around that scale and pace. So as part of a project called Operation 2030, I worked with the Clean Energy Transition Institute to define scale and pace for Washington State. And considering that we have these common 2050 goals around the world and across the country, I don't really have any obvious reason to believe that this scale and pace would be really any different in other areas. So I'd like to use it to frame this discussion today. So starting out with in Washington State, we're looking at needing zero emissions by 2050 in the building sector, and that's to meet our economy-wide emissions limits. This is not a target that we have officially, but this is a target that we created as part of Operation 2030. So we basically need to get the whole job done by 2050. And having an endpoint is daunting, but it also opens up opportunities. And I'd really say that it's a mandate for structural and systemic change, because it's very different than incremental change without any defined input. So that's essentially zero emissions. And we also mean very low energy, interactive with flexible demand. That's basically the definition of zero emissions building by the Department of Energy. So that's what we really mean by decarbonization and achieving this scale. And so that's essentially across every home and building by 2050, the total complete transformation of the building stock. So just so that we've level set that's what we mean by scale, the complete job. And that means everyone as a part of that. So there is an equity side of it as well. So, but that's the scale by 2050. But what does that mean to actually scale it? So when we looked at this in Washington, we determined that we must transform the market by 2030 in order to achieve that total building stock transformation by 2050. So that's the adjusted version of scale. If you're going to reach that scale by 2050, by 2030, essentially, you're not putting in any emitting equipment in any buildings, not new buildings, not old buildings. You're just not doing it anymore, because the numbers don't add up by 2050 if you don't stop at a certain point. So 2030 to 2050, 2030 to about 2035, that's what scale means. Anything less than that does not get the total job done, which is what we established was the scale by 2050. So to further frame things up, I just wanted to share 3 key frames from Scale 2030, which is a follow-on to Operation 2030, which is looking at, okay, that's what we need to do. How do we get that done? So what we're looking at is, and I think it's a good frame for this discussion, is how can we center buildings in the clean energy transition? How can we really think of them as buildings, the building performance as a resource, instead of more legacy, disaggregated, atomized versions of that, where we just have efficiency as a resource, and then we have all of these other things, and they don't really come together in a coherent way. So how do we really center buildings and center building performance? And then how do we take a whole society approach to building decarbonization? So we're looking at industrial scale implementation, and also some sort of strategic investment framework that is really up to the job of industrial scale implementation. So with that as kind of a base and a frame for the type of work that our panelists are involved in and their ideas for how we scale and pace, I'd like to have the panelists introduce themselves. And really, if you could just explain briefly the work that you do, and then also some insights that you have at this point of where we are today with regard to innovation in the built environment. Is the pace accelerating? Are we lagging in our overall efforts? Where do you kind of set us currently? So I'm going to start with Celeste Tell, and she has a slide that she'd like to use for her introduction. So I'm going to move to that, and then we'll just move on to the main introductions and panel discussion. I'll let you take it from here, Celeste.
Thanks, Poppy. Hello, everybody. I'm Celeste Tell, co-founder and managing director for Epicycled. Epicycled consults on circular economy in the built environment, and primarily in the area of workplace and tenant spaces. We've also developed a model for agile workspace that operationalizes the principles of the circular economy, while at the same time creating an exceptional user experience and helping to create other new business models, and are preparing to launch with key partners within the next year in Seattle. While much of the industry is focused on shell and core, Epicycled focuses on tenant spaces because tenant spaces generally last 1 to 5 years and are constantly being scraped and rebuilt, with huge impact to the waste stream and planetary health. So our emphasis is more on embodied carbon and associated emissions rather than on just operational emissions. Even before the pandemic, over the last 20 years, business has changed and how businesses use buildings has changed, but the industry has not kept up. And I think that's fundamental to innovation and focusing on the future. We do need to fundamentally rethink not only what the business model is for rental spaces, but how we design, build, operate, and cycle those spaces while addressing real user needs, reducing waste, and generating ROI all at the same time. So this slide I put up, I was going to describe this as sort of my baseline that keeps me focused, but it's just easier to show you the photograph. You may or may not be familiar with this. These are the 9 planetary boundaries that have been developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center. And this was initially developed in 2009. And then they updated it in 2015 and updated again in 2023. And so you can see that climate change, in fact, is only 1 out of 9 planetary boundaries. And when they began in 2009, really only 3 had exceeded the planetary boundary. And what that means is the boundary is the line between a safe operating space and an increasing risk to not being in a safe operating space. And so to me, you can read the details or not read the details. What's important here is the trajectory. And for all the work we're doing, not only are we not holding in one place, but the planet is in much worse condition today than it was in 2009. So when I think about 2050, how are we going to turn it around and get to those 2050 goals, given all these metrics? So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Celeste. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to have Lucas introduce yourself.
Thanks, Poppy, and thanks everyone for being here today. Appreciate being part of the conversation. I'm Lucas Toffoli from RMI. You may know us as Rocky Mountain Institute. We're a think, do, scale tank. That's what we call ourselves, because we're not just thinking, and we're not even just doing anymore. Now we're also, as Poppy framed it very well, really focused on that scale aspect. Our mission is to transform global energy systems to secure a clean, prosperous, zero carbon future for all. And we do that across the world's major economic sectors. I work within our buildings program, which is one of our larger practices. And within that, I lead our multifamily work, as well as our construction innovation focus area. And really excited about the conversation today. I think these are all the things that we need to be talking about. And if I can throw a slide up here real quick, which I think I can, I'm going to add another frame that I think fits very nicely with Poppy's introduction. That to me is a big part of the challenge that we have ahead of us, which is the idea of what I call market delivery capacity, broadly speaking, and the fact that we really need innovation as an essential element to achieve the market capacity that's needed to address the different layers of building sector challenges in a climate-aligned manner. When I think about market capacity, it's not just workforce, it's really a combination of that and technical solutions, productivity, enabling tools, business models, a lot of aspects of the environment and circumstances. And right now we're kind of, unfortunately, the current state without change is going to be, in my mind, a sort of declining capacity trend with sort of dated solutions being the standard practice, an aging out workforce when we think about construction, declining productivity in a lot of areas within that sector, especially as compared to kind of other modernized economic sectors, and lots of institutional barriers. So when we think about getting to that really important 2030 point that we hope will be an inflection point, we need to kind of reverse this trend line. And so we need to kind of layer on additional capacity just to meet sort of our steady state needs. That means building enough housing just to keep up. That means kind of the basic, maintenance and updates. We need to add even more to address the backlog that we've dug ourselves into, both on housing units where we're missing probably several million of them, as well as deferred maintenance gaps across the entire stock. And then finally, we need to deal with the huge challenge of our existing building stock, something like 130 million buildings across the United States. And most of those are going to need some kind of work to become climate aligned. So we need to really stand up the capacity to address all of these and again, kind of reverse this trend. And so innovation is really a key part of that. And innovation in my mind means technical solutions, but also streamlining the ability to deploy those solutions through improved processes, improved methods, and as well as an enabling environment and the right kind of stakeholder engagement with what's really a kind of complex, multifaceted set of stakeholders in the built environment. So looking forward to getting into it. I'll stop sharing here and hand it back over to you, Poppy.
Great. Thank you, Lucas. Welcome to the panel. I think now we'll hand things over to Alan Prager.
Thank you, Poppy. Great to be here and part of this discussion. I'm a partner at a venture firm, Building Ventures. We're early stage investors, very much focused on the built environment. And my journey in the space really started back in the 90s with a venture-funded startup in the AEC space. So we were building CAD software that ran on personal computers, IBM PCs. But we, were fortunate enough to have an IPO. We were ultimately acquired by Autodesk, and became part of the team there that built the first generation of BIM products. So over the past 20 years, my partners who had a sort of similar trajectory, we've been operating and investing in built environment startups. We've seen the impact of innovation expand pretty dramatically from the early days when you could sort of count the number of venture-funded startups on one hand to today where we're literally tracking, many thousands of built environment startups that are forming every year. So we've really seen an acceleration there. And also an expansion of the scope of the impact that these startups can have. So initially, it was really all about individual and company productivity, which was, funding the investment and deployment of this innovation. And examples of some of the companies we were involved in are SketchUp, which many of you may know, which was kind of, in the conceptual design space. And then the company that I co-founded, a company called Newforma, you may not know them, but sort of one of the leaders in the project management space for architects and engineers. But today, sort of, we're seeing that the impact of this innovation is really much more broad, and that's thanks to a lot of the new technologies, the novel technologies that have emerged. Just the fact that SaaS and mobile is just kind of prolific. It's everywhere, and now you have a way to really digitally enable the physical world, job sites, and also buildings, smart buildings, and to really move the needle, I think, in some of these areas like carbon emissions, safety, equity or inequity that we see in the built environment. So while we are for-profit venture capitalists, we find ourselves kind of, the scope of our startups really having a broader impact. So pretty optimistic that we can get to 2050. And I guess, maybe it's blind optimism, but, most of the companies we're investing in have these crazy ideas. And so we have to kind of be a little bit crazy to believe that they can be successful. And so, yeah.
Great. Welcome. Well, I think starting out on the right foot of optimism and excitement. All right, well, let's have Steve introduce yourself and then we'll start the conversation.
All right, morning all. I'm excited to participate. I've been participating in Smart Buildings Exchange from the outside for a while, so excited to be on a panel here. I'm Steve Ruby, Head of Innovation at McKinstry. I sit within our corporate venture practice that we call Dawson Ventures, which is our attempt at tackling this problem of advancing innovation to enable our 2050 goals head on. So through that venture practice, we partner with entities like Allen and Building Ventures, where we're a limited partner in their fund, and use that for not only the relationships that are built for the things that they fund, but also a pipeline of us understanding what else is out there. We're heavily invested, especially from the side of our sweat equity, time and effort, more so than just capital, in taking these early stage startups and helping them bridge the gap to marketability and usefulness within the built environment, right? So many of these early stage startups, I think we see, that cutting their teeth and going through growing pains in early stages, need all the support that they can get so that they don't really fail for the wrong reasons, right? I mean, we see lots of innovative and new technology approaching the built environment, and sometimes some of the best ideas don't succeed for reasons other than the technology, right? They're maybe ill-funded or don't have the right leadership, don't have the right go-to-market plan. So our approach within Dawson Ventures at McKinstry is really to reach into that pool of new innovations, both in new construction and construction technology, the things that help us build mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems in buildings better, and the things that help us operate and drive existing buildings to a zero carbon footprint. So reaching into that pool of startups and our base of customers, and trying to get some early stage prototypes, get some wins in the hands of these exciting new technologies so that they can advance down the road of becoming affordable, scalable, trustable, and safe and reliable for installation in buildings at scale, which is really what it takes to move from an early stage startup to something that has large scale impact on our 2050 goals. In addition to our venture studio performing that function, we've started a business with an entity called Generate Capital, called Veritas, that's all about funding at scale some of these implementations within buildings. I think we see, especially within our existing buildings, the need for finance solutions and economic solutions that drive installation of these new solutions to get us to scale. So excited to join in the conversation today, but that's more about what we're up to.
Great, thanks, Steve, and welcome. And I think it's just really clear that our list of panelists here are clearly deeply engaged in the implementation and really trying to achieve scale and using innovation to achieve that scale. So I think that's great. And I'd like to address the first question to get things started here. I'd like to address the first question to Alan, and I'd like to hear others' responses as well. Alan, you are constantly scanning the market and companies who have innovative ideas that they want to bring to market, they need to find capital resources to help make that happen. And so my question is, do we have a problem there? Is there actually a sufficient amount of capital flowing to this area to get the job done, to get that complete job done? Is that really a bottleneck, or is that maybe not the main issue? Just wondering what your thoughts are on that. And if not, what needs to happen to accelerate capital deployment that will be sufficient to meet the pace of change that we really desperately need?
That's a great question, and my simple answer, for the sake of all of us, is and for the planet, is I really hope so. We, from our perspective, have witnessed that the flow of capital entering the built environment innovation has grown dramatically from the early 2000s, when it seemed like we were sort of in a big echo chamber all by ourselves investing in built environment startups, to today, where we've actually, just in the last 5 years, I think we've witnessed what we would call within our world a couple of bubbles where we've had so much capital entering the space, and we've seen almost like sort of the Y2 or the internet bubble of the early 2000s. We've seen some startups and crazy valuations, and startups blow up, and so, which on the surface you think, well, that's not great, but actually it is an indication that there is a lot of capital flowing. There's a realization that increasingly that construction and building operations are woefully inefficient. So there's that kind of standard sort of how do we improve productivity? But I think emerging now as a force is this realization that buildings account for 40% of carbon emissions, 40% of energy usage, 40% of landfill waste. And so we're starting to see other types of capital, not just generalist VC capital chasing profit, but pure climate tech VCs who have different mandates, impact investors. We're seeing more of the sort of non-dilutive government grants, which can be very helpful to startups, particularly in areas where they're trying to have an impact and may need some additional tailwinds there. So I'd say that we have a lot of capital in sort of different forms. And maybe one of the things that would really help is if we could see some real successful companies emerge in the space, some real unicorns that could show that there's a real opportunity here and to bring even more capital in the space. So, and I think we have companies that are ready to scale, that are ready to be deployed, and technologies that can really have an impact. And just within our own portfolio, I can point to one company called AeroSeal. And what they do is they use like a sealing technology. It's an aerosolized material that they blow into a building. So they pressurize the building, or they blow it into duct systems. So they pressurize the duct systems, and it finds all the leaks and seals them. And 30% of the energy, up to 30% of the energy that goes into the built environment, escapes through leaks in buildings and ductwork. And so if you can address that, then that can have a huge impact. It's a proven technology. Tens of thousands of buildings a year are sealed. But if we really want to have an impact towards the 2050 goal, we need to get to like tens of millions of buildings a year. So that requires, other forces. So where, maybe sealing enclosures becomes some kind of a, regulatory requirement. There's just increased awareness of the potential of something like this to really scale the capabilities. So I'd be interested in hearing what some of the other panelists think in terms of that notion that we have a lot of the tools we need. It's just a matter of how do we get them into the marketplace?
Yeah, I chime
Go ahead.
in. Yeah, I think a lot of help from the owners, especially institutional owners, who I hear we have a lot of today, to help navigate smaller scale pilots to move some of these technologies forward and create the trust that some of these companies need to get to scale. And I know it's hard to do that in a safe way, right? That doesn't impact occupant comfort or something like that, but developing smaller scale implementations of some of these new technologies is probably more important than capital to some of these entities.
So I'm interested in what others think about this as well. It sounds like Alan feels that there is sufficient amount of capital. It's really a matter of how it gets manifested, how it gets implemented out, and hopefully that there's more kind of hyper investment in the most strategic innovations that can really scale. So it seems like we need to be more discerning. It's not just about having enough capital flow for everything. There are some key solution sets, but what are others thinking? Do you agree that there is a sufficient amount of capital flowing, or do you have anything else to add? Any nuance to this?
Sorry, I was on mute because my dog was barking. Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what Steve was just saying. I think that there's from what Alan's saying, there's a lot of top-down capital that has a particular way of operating, but I think there's a lot of people and entities out there that are working on things that don't believe they fit into that model, more of a bottom up. And I think, and the idea of creating smaller pilots or having money go to smaller pilots and accepting that they might fail, because that's part of it. If the capital needs to succeed and become a unicorn, I think that scares a lot of people away that might be doing interesting things that with some support and nurturance could become a thing. And I'll throw out an example I was going to throw out later, but I mean, there's a guy in Bellingham, literally a guy in Bellingham. And what he started doing is he started in Portland. He consults with municipalities to get them to pass laws that prohibit mechanical demolition of buildings older than 1940. And then he also works with the local contractors to train the contractors to do deconstruction rather than demolition. And then he works with the salvage businesses to up their game and improve their business models so that fewer buildings get demolished, materials stay out of the waste stream and in the use stream. And he's now done that. He's done that in Portland, San Antonio, Boulder. He just got done with a cross Canada tour and was in New York. And he could use some funding to help scale this, but I don't know that he sees himself particularly as a, as a candidate for that. And so, I think there are people doing really interesting things that could scale, but they're not in that sort of venture pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to focus in a little bit on this idea of the solution sets and the technologies. Obviously, we need a whole system approach, and we need a lot more beyond just those. But when it comes down to it, we need innovation, not just in terms of creating new things, but creating ways of more effectively implementing the things that we already know. And so for me, I know this is kind of an oversimplification, but if you think about it from both the residential and the commercial side, if you're looking at the decarbonization part on the single family residential, you're looking at central heat pumps, air source heat pumps. We have not cracked that nut. We do not know how to do that well, even though we've been doing it for 30 years or more. So that's a big thing. But then you have on the commercial side, most buildings are kind of small, medium, simple commercial buildings. We're looking at your kind of generic garden variety RTU heat pumps, a rooftop unit heat pumps. So that could basically be almost 80% of the decarbonization of the entire building sector is just those kind of two technologies. Gross oversimplification. But based on that maybe polemical idea, I'd like to switch over to Steve for a bit and hear a little bit more about your market experience. So you and your colleagues are actively standing up companies, as you described, that are bringing innovative products and services to the built environment. So really thinking about that innovation in delivery and implementation side of it. Just wondering, what has been the market's reaction to new ways of designing, building, and operating the built environment, or maybe even just new ways of implementing old things, however you want to structure it, whatever comes to mind. Where are things kind of landing right now out in the marketplace in terms of those companies' reaction?
Yeah, thanks, Poppy. And I know, since SBX is Seattle-based, we've got a lot of people in Seattle familiar with McKinstry. That's where our headquarters are, but especially the online conferences here have national reach. So real briefly, McKinstry is a mechanical, electrical, plumbing contractor in the Pacific Northwest. And nationally, we work in existing buildings and new construction through consulting services and retrofit construction, especially financed retrofit projects throughout the nation, many of which are in institutional, university, municipal healthcare type customers. So that's sort of framing for the types of customers that we see that we're trying to advance, right? So many of these customers are directly attached to constituent-driven mandates for decarbonization in their buildings, which certainly helps. But at the end of the day, I think, one of the biggest challenges we see in large commercial buildings is some of these technologies need de-risked. And I mean that in a few different ways, right? I mean, we've got folks presumably on the line that are ultimately responsible for occupant comfort and building functionality, uptime of critical systems like data centers, and inserting new technologies into that is often a scary proposition. So I think that's a little bit of the gap that we see, right? There's new technologies, like you mentioned, heat pumps, in spite of the fact that they've existed for 30 plus years, are still in need of de-risking from an operational perspective. So I think that's one thing that we see is customers that are hungry, have an appetite, and in some cases mandates either from CEOs or from constituents to decarbonize existing buildings. But what they really need are ways to cover the gap between, bleeding edge technology and that which is available, affordable, scalable, and they know it's going to keep their occupants comfortable, operators and constructors safe, and drive down operating costs in those buildings. Because oftentimes, we're looking at things where we're trading utility costs and carbon producing operation costs for things that have potentially higher first cost, and we're expecting life cycle levels in cost reduction along with our carbon reduction. So I think navigating through that, as you mentioned, Poppy, we have 2 startups that we started ourselves, in addition to pulling from the likes of companies that Alan focuses on, and even RMI's third derivative focuses on, trying to help pull those into buildings in ever increasing scale in order to help accelerate that. And I think somebody said it earlier, Alan did, hoping a few wins, a few unicorns from some of these startups go a long ways, not only for that startup, but for capital going into the larger environment. I think the same goes for trust, right? If we can get promotional PR and yes, to Celeste's point, there are going to be failures along the way. That is the nature of innovation. But when we can prop up the successes and people can see the light at the end of the tunnel with some of the new and exciting stuff functioning, not creating risk for tenants or occupants or operators, then I think, those are the things that really move mountains on this.
And you mentioned de-risk and started to bring in this question of cost, and I wanted to explore that a little bit further. So how are you really structuring your market conversations around this question of cost effectiveness? Because we have that come up with programs, policies, we have market actors treating it differently. And it does seem really important in relation to this de-risk. It's perception, but it's also a reality in many cases. And I'm interested in other panelists' thoughts on this as well. What are our mental models around cost effectiveness? How do we maybe need to shift those models?
I'd say a quick note, and then I can pass it on. I think scale and cost effectiveness is a big part of it, right? And when we're entering into a pilot with a new technology and it has a cost that's here, maybe that cost is somewhat covered by utility programs or government programs. Or are we putting our collective investment in a product that we know has a cost down curve, that we know when it gets to scale, it's going to no longer need some of those other incentives and grants in order to meet customer financial objectives. Lots of times that just involves getting to scale, right? Getting manufacturing to scale, getting supply chain elements for the particular technology to scale, and getting new companies and new technologies through that hump so that they can get into the curve on the hockey stick is probably the biggest part of cost, right? I mean, you saw that happen with the solar industry, right? I mean, heavily propped up early on from grants and incentives in order to get things done. And, in many markets, those have waned significantly. Net metering rules, unfortunately, have changed, but yet we're still, solar is still a very viable option. It took, 2 decades or slightly more. And it's, for some of these technologies, it doesn't feel like we have quite that much time, but I think, watching the way that went through the market is bellwether for other technologies to follow.
Interesting. Yeah, we're looking at trade-offs also, where in areas where you have a building performance standard, you really can use solar to meet those EUI targets, but you could also implement other technologies, other solutions. And so thinking about how you really balance those seems to be part of the equation as well. And so what are other panelists thinking about this question of cost effectiveness? How does that show up in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a critical question, and I think redefining it, as you put it, Poppy, is really fundamental to kind of getting the scale, getting the uptake that we're looking for here. I talked about market delivery capacity. It's also about what we call market transformation in the kind of consulting sense of the word, where you need to make the new solutions more attractive in a way that kind of the choice is clear. And I think that's partly about addressing a lot of different layers of decision making in the built environment, where demand is not just like one person making decisions. Even in a given building, you might have 3 or 4 layers of what you might call demand, from the tenant to the asset manager to the owner to the investor to even the regulatory environment that has a stake in it. So part of it is making the case not to demand monolithically, but to kind of all those different layers. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, part of it is about looking critically at what is the implicit baseline in our cost effectiveness conversations, and again, being honest that the current baseline isn't really neutral, right? The way that we're doing things now is not kind of this zero line that you're comparing against. It's actually a pretty negative trend line. We can limit ourselves to 18-month paybacks all the way to an unlivable world and unlivable buildings. And so I think we need to think about what is the risk in the current implicit baseline that isn't actually being factored in. That's transition risk, it's climate risk, both from extreme and chronic events. It's also the risk of just the fact that the current practices in building, construction, and renovation don't really yield optimal outcomes, even looking at just the building itself. I mean, I challenge you to open up any building and not find mold or moisture problems or unbalanced ventilation or mechanicals, even though those are the very risks that often get brought up when we're talking about new technologies. And people say, well, but what about the mold, or what about the moisture management? It's like, guess what? That's already in there in your buildings right now. And we're trying to address these bigger problems and also be thoughtful about those, those kind of building science issues like the mold, the moisture, the ventilation. So, I think it's really it's a complicated question, but it's something that I think it's incumbent on all of us to drive those aspects of the conversation, and to ask the question and hold people accountable to really thinking through this in a holistic way, and then encourage all the folks on the quote unquote demand side who are on the line here to to also ask those questions about, hey, what is really implicit in our value judgments about how we make decisions on technologies and on investments in our buildings. And, is it really prudent to continue investing in our buildings using, call it, broadly speaking, underwriting or decision paradigms from the past several decades when, the parameters have really changed. So I'll get off my soapbox here and hand it back to you, Poppy. But obviously a topic that I think is really important for all of us to look at critically.
Yeah, I can definitely see that I feel that you're really wrapping your arms around and trying to grapple with the immense complexity of the specific transition for the building sector. Before I move on, any other thoughts on this question of cost effectiveness or anything that Lucas was just discussing?
I would just add that we're stuck in a paradigm where lowest first cost and on day one is still the paradigm for cost effectiveness. Until we change that, nothing's going to really change. And so, and we're also stuck in a paradigm of looking at individual systems. Like, we're going to look at our HVAC system, we're going to look at our data distribution system, and we're going to look at the building, but we're not looking at the whole and the integration of all those systems together and what the impacts are over time. And so
what we really see in Washington at the building sector level when we look at the state energy strategy is that we have these outcomes that require holistically changes in buildings, and we still have a complete paradigm that in almost no way has adapted to that holistic imperative. So that kind of leads me to some additional questions that I actually had for you, Lucas. If we think about RMI's founder, Amory Levins, he once said that we, quote, must bridge the gap between knowledge and action. And that feels like that's really the tension of characterizing where we're at right now. And we have a lot of available technology at our disposal. Some would even say that it's more than sufficient to meet the challenge. I've just mentioned that, 2 technologies could deal with 80% of the decarb. May or may not be true. But, and yet we're struggling to see the adoption at a sufficient scale. There have been ACEEE estimates that say we're on a 300-year schedule, not a 25-year schedule. This is just this insane level of dissonance. So change, I guess the question really is, why is what can you, how can you summarize why we're really in that situation, and others on the panel as well? Why is it really different in the building sector? And if so, why?
Well, I'm biased because I like working in the building sector. That's my sector, like many of us. So, I think it is different. I think in some ways that makes it more interesting. In many ways that makes it more complicated. And I think I've touched on a couple of pieces that get at your question, which is definitely the right one. And anyone who's seen Amory Levin's speak, you've probably heard people ask similar questions of him in the seminars and workshops that he gives. So, I think, again, I started with this idea of market delivery capacity. And I think that's a critical piece of it. And to me, within that, it's not just how do we kind of increase the size of the pipeline to just push more through it. It's also how do we do more with what we have. We heard Alan talking about productivity being even from early on one of the decision points in technologies, but also in implementation. And that productivity piece, it does have a technical aspect. How do you get more kind of manufacturing efficiencies or things like that in the built environment? But it also has a really important process aspect that is both about the people who are physically doing the work and systematizing their processes, having aspects of construction move from what is still in some ways a cottage industry to something that's more modern and integrated. But it's also about kind of systematizing and leveling up a lot of the other processes on the regulatory side, which is extraordinarily fragmented in buildings, probably more so than any other industry, but also on the decision-making side, where right now, a lot of times, many of the things that we're talking about, they do get talked about, but they sort of get talked about in this like ancillary way. And then people are saying like, okay, well, that's nice. Maybe we'll do some of that. And then they go back to like, all right, now I got to design this mechanical system or, whatever it is. And I'm going to, take project, N-1 and write, erase that and write project N on it and then change a few things. And that's what Amory sometimes calls infectious repetitus, where the habits of the industry are really to just kind of tweak around the margins and work off of what you've done before, which really makes it hard to Celeste's point, get at that holistic change. And it also ties back to what I was saying about risk and what is our implicit kind of baseline of risk, because we think, hey, if I use the thing I did on the last project, that's not very risky because I've already done it before. And it's like, well, actually, maybe that has in it the inherited risk of every time that you've done that before and not actually thought through it to make it better, to make it optimal. So part of that comes down to education, both on the craft work side and on the AEC side of changing the way that all of us approach projects and do it in a more kind of integrated way, and look for opportunities for improvement, yes, in a way that's safe. And part of it is, again, on the owner side, that your whatever layer of the demand stack you're on, you're in those rooms where decisions are being made. You have the power to ask those questions and say, hey, what about this? Or actually, let's not put that aside right now. I want to make sure that that's actually front and center. That's an integral part of the design, the decision, the investment conversation, the risk conversation. So again, a long and complicated answer for a long and complicated question.
Yeah, well, it seems like it's also about the evolution of the industry, but to get that, it's changing expectations for how that evolution happens and the pace of the evolution, let alone accomplishing the objectives of that evolution. So it's like when we're in World War II, that analogy is often used. You build that tanker in a year. You don't not build the tanker in the year. It's just a totally different expectation, and we haven't set that kind of expectation framework on this. So that said, I'd like to see if any of the other panelists have some thoughts. I know this is the $16 trillion question, but why do we have that 275-year gap in the timeline, if I'm quoting ACEEE correctly?
Well, I hope part of it is that, we're just assuming more of the same, and we're just extrapolating from what we've seen. But I think, we have just a number of possibilities here. Like, the fragmentation in our industry is part of the challenge, right? But as we've digitized more and more of how we operate the industry, how we operate construction and how we operate buildings, and that's happening in SaaS. And now we have, generative AI and machine learning and other advanced data techniques to enable us to, maybe connect the dots better. And I think we have a unique opportunity where we have some progressive owners that are starting to measure or utilize or look at sort of carbon reduction as an equal to cost reduction as they evaluate decisions around a program. And that's, primarily driven in certain sectors like data centers, as Steve would be very much aware. The owners of these hyperscalers, they're very much driving the whole supply chain to, reduce carbon and become more efficient, largely because they just have such large energy requirements. But in the same way that in the space age, right, we took what perhaps in a natural evolution might have taken, I don't know, maybe hundreds of years. We took that down to 10 years. And then a lot of the innovation that was created there just kind of bled over into other industries, right? Manufacturing and such. And I think maybe something similar can happen with these advanced owners that are doing this work and then creating technologies that bleed over into kind of the long tail to address some of the issues that, Celeste was bringing up. How do we deal with these, at the, not the data center level, but the, smaller building level, some of these issues at scale. So I don't know what the other panelists feel, but I think that it does feel like we're at the early innings of something that could really have an impact.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, go ahead. Actually, I was going to see if you had any thoughts to chime in on.
Yeah, I think, unlike the other, it's good to look at telecom and other industries for pace of innovation. But I think obvious biggest difference with the built environment is life cycle, right? We're talking about assets with, in many cases, 50+ year life, and his, treating those with infectious I'm not going to do it right, Lucas. Whatever Amory's word is a big problem in the industry, right? I mean, we need change in an industry that's change averse, that's used to this incredibly long life cycle. And there are ways we can take advantage of it, right? I mean, really need to obliterate or look past the financial situations that cause heavy look at first cost versus life cycle cost effectiveness of some of these technologies. I mean, if, especially our institutional building owners are building 50-year buildings, you got to look at, what's going to happen over 50 years. Can I afford to, install systems that result in zero fuel cost, right? I mean, if take solar as just a simple example, right? If its first cost is much higher, but then the fuel cost is free sun, am I really looking at that over the life cycle of the building? I think, especially in commercial real estate, we have, too many financial structures that cause us to incentivize reduced first cost, which really works against some of the evolving decarbonizing technologies. So somehow we got to take advantage of the fact that we're building 50-year assets and not cell phones. I mean, not even automobiles, right? I mean, people typically don't keep their automobiles for 50 years. Yeah.
Yeah, good points. And I think that where this discussion is really shifting is into this question of new models and what are those new models. So on that subject, I'd like to get your input, Celeste, on a few things. I know that you spend time thinking and working about how to change the economics of sustainability. When we think about innovation, it clearly isn't limited to just technology. We clearly have some, I'd say, recalcitrant models that we're working within. Are we the models? Did we create them, or are they, controlling us? It's not clear at this point. So when we think about, well, I just wanted to see what your thoughts are on how we create new models, both for investment in sustainability and how to really think about how return on investment is understood, kind of building off of what Steve was saying about thinking about these longer term assets and the business models about how we're treating the physical environment.
Where to start? I think what Steve was talking about 50-year life cycles of buildings, but in fact, the tenants in those buildings have life cycles of 1 to 5 years, sometimes less. And so one of the questions is, what are we designing for? And I think and I say we, because having been part of this industry for a very long time, we have taught and convinced ourselves to design these custom bespoke buildings that address a program which is locked in time and space, right? So we take a snapshot of what's needed at a particular time and space, and we develop a program, and then we design to that program, and then we build that program, and then we're shocked when there's change orders. Well, we should realize that that's actually what's really happening. But so for me, I tend to focus, I think one of the disconnects is our industry is focused on certainty, but in order to innovate, we have to move past certainty. And we really have to start looking at flexibility, adaptability, designing for an uncertain future. And I really think that, and along with that comes the financial models for designing for an uncertain future. Financial models are all about certainty. I mean, I have this situation with clients all the time where everybody wants to do the circular solution and everybody's excited and everybody's on board. And then the CFO gets it and they're like, well, wait a minute, we have to have our 7-year depreciation line item in our financials. We can't do this. And then everything goes out the window. Sometimes it takes an organization with vision and with the financial wherewithal to do something really innovative, but we can't wait. We can't wait for many of those. But one example that I love to use is, is anyone familiar with Google's Alta Garage in San Jose? So Google needed a new parking garage, but they weren't sure how long they were going to need the parking garage. And so they actually took a scenario-based, flexible, adaptable approach. And if you haven't seen this, you can look it up on Google. But what they did is they designed a structure that could be a parking garage, that could be multifamily housing, that could be commercial office space. And they played out each of those scenarios and designed what would go in at another point in time, depending on what the economy does, right? Or depending on how things evolve. So it's a parking garage today, but that structure can also adapt and convert into housing or commercial office space. Google was able to do that because Google has a lot of money, and B, within San Jose had a lot of influence with permitting agencies, right? If a small unknown company went to try to do that. It would be a really uphill battle. But now we have that one example. But how do we help companies, and this goes back to what Steve was talking about earlier with the institutional owners. How do we help companies start to create that? How do we shift to that being the norm? I think that's really the thing. We as an industry for a while convinced everybody that sustainability costs more money. And so that's, I think, where we get into I always tell people circular economy has two words, and the second one is economy. And that's because there's actually return on investment there. But it's not the kind of return on investment that Alan's focused on with venture and investment. It's for a building owner. We can develop a system of how that building's used that's based on interfacing systems and kit of parts that can be used over and over and over again and adapt. And there's starting to be, for a while, there weren't individual systems to fit into that model. There's starting to be more individual systems, but it's still the orchestrating of that and the financing of that. And it really always comes down to the financing. And but I think it's education. I think we have to just continue to educate and get people excited about wanting to try something different. And I think I'll just sort of stop there. I think otherwise I'm going to get redundant with some things other people have said or I've said already.
Well, thank you, Celeste. I think that was a great kind of ending part of the discussion. We are getting toward the end of our panel. We only have about 10 minutes left here. So I feel like this has been a very thoughtful and I think kind of compassionate discussion about where we're at in the industry in relation to our overall goals. And so I'd like to open things up for some questions from the audience, and then we're going to come back to the panel and close things out with a lightning round. So Stan, do we have any questions that we can tee up here for about 5 or 6 minutes and see what thoughts we have from the audience?
Hi, thanks, Poppy. Yes, and audience continue to send in questions through the Q&A function. There was one that came in that's a bit, I consider it kind of a provocative question. It's, is new technology worthwhile to building occupants if it needs legislation mandating its use to be successful? And I think they're taking the tack to say, is there the potential for adversely impacting vulnerable occupants in the short term by increasing prices? So this, I think, to me, gets into the mix of what's the right balance between sort of policy pushes in the market versus other market forces. So it might be interesting to hear the panelists' reflections on that question.
Throw some thoughts in there, Stan. I think legislative, and I'd put in both mandates and maybe use of publicly available funds in terms of incentives in the same boat as this answer goes. But on one hand, are a lever that ought to be used extremely carefully, especially because of increased cost to eventual renters or tenants in buildings, as was mentioned. On the other hand, without some pointed follow this direction, here's the center of the target, it is hard for the capital and the investment and the startups in the innovation space to move in a uniform direction to get to create standards, to create funding streams, to get to scale. I think we end up often a little bit scattered without that sort of push nudge or ideally centered focus that can really only come from policy, unfortunately.
One thing we haven't really touched on in the panel is, a force that is far greater than any policy, which we've witnessed in the last 4 or 5 years, and that is my office is in downtown San Francisco. where occupancy is below 50% of pre-COVID, pre-pandemic levels. So I think, and the government is starting to realize, is wake up to the fact that, well, actually, this could be an interesting opportunity, right? It's tragic for, the investors and owners of these buildings, but if you step back, there's an opportunity here. So I'm not quite sure how it's going to develop. Maybe there's others that have opinions on that in the audience or on the panel, but it's something that's kind of global that I think could actually be part of the solution if we can come up with some creative ideas.
Thanks, Steve. Maybe is there one other question, perhaps, Stan? I'm looking at the Q&A, and it looks like there are a lot of really great comments and points, and I really look forward to reading those after the session. But are there any that rise up as a good question that we can ask the panel in this kind of closing out time?
Yeah, one quick one from Ellie here that I think is interesting, in that you've mentioned as a panel some individual success stories which are inspiring, but she's wondering whether or not you have any examples of where skilled innovation is happening right now in real time. And I suppose that could be both in terms of thinking about models in the building sector, but also industrial sectors as well. Where are some models of scaled innovation that's happening right at the moment? If in fact we have some.
Yeah, I mean, I throw out storage as one that people may be widely understanding of, right? I think people are aware, between growth in data centers and diversity from renewable energy sources, we have significant grid constraints that we're dealing with. And in order to reduce cost of operating the grid, and therefore, tenants paying for utilities, diversifying and liberating the approach to managing peak demand through technologies like building direct building interventions and energy storage are innovating rapidly in real time, and getting to that point of trust that I mentioned pretty quickly. And it's a little bit maybe some would consider adjacent to decarbonizing our buildings, but not really, right? It's a little bit of a downstream effect of, again, some of the renewable mix on the grid and approaches to how we attach electrified transportation and heat pumps to the buildings, causing some shift. So I think that's one example where we're seeing very rapid and scaled innovation.
I would also add offsite construction. So I think it could be, it can always be more and faster, but as we've all said, but I think there's been a lot of movement and progress in terms of commercial scale offsite construction, and there's there's a lot of people starting up in different systems and different companies and different approaches to that. But that reduces emissions during construction. It reduces embodied carbon. It's speed to market. There's a lot of benefits. I'm sorry about the dogs in the background. And I think that's a real area of success so far.
Yeah, I would plus one, Celeste, your point, and this is near to my heart because I love industrialized, and offsite construction. I think there's a huge amount of promise there. And as you said, I think there's been a lot of progress and there can be a lot more. But building on Alan's point about, hey, what happened in downtown San Francisco and other cities with COVID, an area where we've seen offsite construction really kind of flex its muscle is in another response to tragedy, which is wildfire rebuilding, where offsite construction has really been able to have the high performance designed into the system from the beginning and that fast deployment so that people can basically have their homes and their communities rebuilt, but better, stronger, more resilient by having that kind of inbuilt innovation in the offsite construction space. And I think compared to past decades, because offsite construction isn't really a new idea, there's been a huge amount of progress in digital enablement. That's another thing that heard from all the panelists that I think is unlocking some of the capabilities in offsite construction. So hoping to see that continue to scale in several different areas.
Thanks, Lucas, and great questions. We're going to wrap things up now, and we're going to close with a lightning session. So if each of the panelists, and I'll call you out by name, if each of the panelists could spend significantly less than 1 minute on this round, and really we're just looking at what makes you the most optimistic that we will indeed meet our 2050 goals? And is there one thing that you think is the most important thing for us to avoid in order to ensure success? So I'm going to start out with Steve. You're on.
Sorry, get to the mute button there. Yeah, I think, especially within our institutional customers, those that are doing right by constituents and those, that they work for, whether it's, university boards or communities for, cities, I think seeing, as they're moving as aggressively as they can in many ways, as the practical realities of the technical solutions are met with both the economics and the reliability of those solutions. I think we just need to see more engagement, and that fire needs to fuel the machine that can continue to create that kind of snowball effect. Perfect.
Alan, you're on.
I think it's the next generation. I mean, we're seeing now young entrepreneurs that are really focusing their attention on the built environment and how to make it more sustainable and drive carbon out of it. And they're moving they're coming to our space from Bitcoin, gaming, e-commerce, and they're moving into our space. And as the father of 3 recent college grads, I can tell you that there's a lot of passion in this area, and there's a lot of we're just seeing a lot of young talent enter the space, and that hasn't been the case for the built environment for some time. We've had a bit of a talent drain. So, I think we don't know what we don't know. And that's my source of optimism.
The next generation. All right, Lucas, you're on.
Yeah, thanks for passing the buck, Alan, there. We'll take it from here. I would say that I have a lot of optimism. We RMI co-leads an initiative called the Advanced Building Construction Collaborative, where we work with a lot of innovators in some of the intersections that we've been talking about today. And what I really love is virtually everyone who participates in that has this mindset of not us against each other, but it's us against the old way of doing things and us working towards the new way of doing things. So just seeing that kind of organically come together in this group that we facilitate and others that we interact with gives me a whole lot of optimism. And then in terms of what's most important for us to avoid, it's kind of the flip side of that. It's this zero sum mindset, and we need to consider that there is so much need here that virtually everyone can stand to gain from the transition, as long as we have our values and our cost effectiveness sort of calibrated in the right way. It's not going to be zero sum. It can be beneficial for all, but we got to think about it the right way and kind of approach it the right way. Back to you, Poppy.
All right, Celeste, we're going to have you close us out here. What makes you most optimistic?
Most optimistic, I think, is sort of the just emergent approaches to bioregionalism, where localized solutions as opposed to generalized one-size-fits-all solutions are being developed specifically for certain areas, like where there's a lot of wildfire, where there's flooding. Like those two areas, those kind of areas need completely different approaches to things. And I think we're starting to see that even more and more. And we all, except maybe Alan, you said you were in California, but most of us are in Cascadia, which is considered one of the sort of most forward-thinking bioregions. And so that gives me a lot of hope that we're starting to do things at a little bit more grassroots level and try things that work locally. What worries me the most is being stuck in business as usual and the complacency of that, and our industry's addiction, I'll call it, to best practices, which to me is like driving while looking in the rearview mirror instead of looking forward.
Yeah, all right. Well, my word cloud, I think, for this closing lightning section is apparently we need industrial scale bioregionalism. So, I know we've gone a little bit over, but I'd like to really thank the panel and also thank the audience members for participating in this session. The next SBX session today will begin at 10:45. Have a great rest of your conference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Poppy, and thanks to the panelists. Great way to kick off our day 2 of SBX. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.